Comedy legend or not, Steve Martin has some serious grudges. Behind the laughter and charm, Martin carried deep frustrations with certain co-stars who made his life on set miserable. For years, he kept quiet about the tension, but now the truth is finally coming out. Let's dive into the six actors Steve Martin openly admitted he hated working with the most. Chevy Chase. When Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short came together in 1986's Three Amigos, audiences saw three comedy legends delivering big laughs in a Western-inspired farce. On screen, the chemistry appeared effortless. Three bumbling, silent film stars accidentally caught in a real-life showdown. But behind the cameras, things weren't nearly so smooth. For Steve Martin, the film became less a celebration of comedic friendship and more a test of patience, especially when it came to working with Chevy Chase. Martin entered the project with his characteristic professionalism. He came to set prepared, knowing his lines, and ready to stick to the script he himself had co-written with Randy Newman and Lorne Michaels. For Martin, structure was everything. Comedy wasn't just about punchlines. It was about rhythm, about timing, about trusting the script that had been carefully crafted. Chevy Chase, however, played by different rules. Already famous from Saturday Night Live and films like Caddyshack and Fletch, Chevy had a reputation in Hollywood as brilliant but difficult. He often chafed at authority, disliked being reined in, and had a knack for rewriting scenes in the moment. On Three Amigos, that reputation followed him. He regularly changed lines, added quips that weren't in the script, and even interrupted takes to throw in jokes aimed at grabbing laughs for himself. To some, this might have seemed like improvisational flair, but to Martin, who prized preparation and balance, it was disruptive. He didn't explode in anger or confront Chevy directly. Steve Martin was far too controlled for that. Instead, he let his feelings seep out in the one way he knew best, through cutting sarcasm. At one point, Martin cracked a line that perfectly summed up his frustrations. If ego is money, Chevy could buy Wall Street. The jab was delivered with a smile, but everyone who heard it knew there was truth behind the humor. For Martin, Chevy's need to dominate every scene was less about collaboration and more about ego, turning what should have been an ensemble comedy into a constant tug-of-war for attention. The tension didn't boil over into a full-blown feud. There were no on-set screaming matches or dramatic walkouts, but the atmosphere was strained. Martin Short, the third amigo, often played the role of peacemaker, bridging the gap between Martin's professionalism and Chase's unpredictability. Still, the damage was done. By the end of filming, Steve Martin had quietly decided he didn't want to repeat the experience. Hollywood, always eager to capitalize on successful pairings, could easily have reunited Martin and Chase in future projects. But Martin declined. While he remained cordial in public, he never sought out another collaboration with Chevy. To him, one film together had been enough. Looking back, Three Amigos stands as both a cult classic and a fascinating study of clashing personalities. Steve Martin's precise, carefully crafted comedy met Chevy Chase's chaotic, ego-driven improvisation, and while audiences laughed at the final product, the process left scars. The contrast between the two men's approaches couldn't have been starker. Martin represented discipline, a man who treated comedy as art, where every beat mattered. Chase represented instinct, a performer who chased laughs at any cost, even if it meant stepping on his co-stars. For a film meant to showcase friendship, the irony was sharp, because when the cameras stopped rolling, Martin and Chase were anything but close. Hollywood and comedy history are filled with tales of mismatched personalities, but one of the more unexpected clashes came between Steve Martin, the king of controlled absurdity, and Bette Midler, the diva of camp, music, and unapologetic showmanship. Both were towering talents in their own right, and both had reputations for captivating audiences. Yet, when the two came together for what should have been a night of collaboration and goodwill, the evening unraveled into a lesson in ego, timing, and very different definitions of teamwork. The setting was a high-profile charity gala, the kind of event designed to showcase both star power and generosity. Steve Martin had agreed to co-host alongside Bette Midler, and in true Martin fashion, he approached the job with precision. He prepared a sharp, witty monologue, the sort of carefully crafted humor that balanced satire with elegance. Audiences had come to expect nothing less from him. His stand-up career and television appearances were built on that meticulous structure. For Martin, sticking to the script was not about stiffness. It was about creating rhythm and respecting the audience's attention. Bette Midler, however, had a very different approach. Known as the Divine Miss M, she thrived on spontaneity, surprise, and commanding the spotlight. To her, a gala wasn't about scripts, it was about spectacle. So, as Steve launched into his monologue, trying to set the comedic tone for the evening, Bette abruptly veered off course. Without warning, she abandoned the prepared script and broke into song, her powerful theatrical voice filling the room, drowning out Martin's words and effectively hijacking the stage. The moment was jarring for Steve Martin. It wasn't just a disruption. It was the unraveling of the careful balance he had worked to create. To an audience, it may have looked like two entertainers trading the spotlight. But to Martin, it felt like sabotage, as though his role had been reduced to little more than a prop in someone else's show. His humor, his timing, his very presence, elements that usually commanded rapt attention, were suddenly brushed aside by Midler's larger-than-life performance. Ever the consummate professional, Martin stayed polite. He didn't snap, argue, or attempt to reclaim the spotlight in the moment. Instead, he kept his composure, smiled through the chaos, and allowed Midler to continue. But the tension was palpable. What was supposed to be a co-hosting partnership had devolved into a one-woman showcase with Martin sidelined. By the middle of the event, Martin had had enough. Quietly, and without spectacle, he walked out early, leaving behind the whirlwind of Midler's improvised takeover. His exit wasn't a tantrum, it was a statement. A man who valued professionalism, preparation, and partnership wasn't going to stand in the wings of what was supposed to be his own stage. Yet Martin's sharpest response came not in the moment, but later in writing. He made a donation to the charity, but with it he left a note that was both witty and cutting. It read, "Telby, it came from her biggest fan, Silence." That single line captured everything he felt: disappointment, irony, and just enough sting to make his point clear for Martin. The clash wasn't about jealousy or insecurity, it was about respect. Steve Martin entered the event anticipating teamwork, a delicate balance between his own refined humor and Bette Midler's theatrical energy. Instead, he discovered that some performers don't merely share the spotlight, they devour it. In true flamboyant fashion, Midler turned what was meant to be a duet into a one-woman spectacle, leaving Martin pushed to the sidelines. The aftermath spoke volumes. Neither launched into a public feud. Martin was never one to indulge in tabloid drama, but the story still spread quietly through Hollywood as a cautionary tale. Even the most seasoned entertainers, it seemed, could find themselves in conflict. Martin's dry, biting remark about the experience lingered as the anecdote everyone remembered, encapsulating his frustration with a sharp wit only he could deliver. At its core, the clash underscored the striking differences between the two stars. Martin's comedy reflected discipline, structure, and balance, the precision of a craftsman. Midler embodied boldness, brash spontaneity, and chaos, a force of performance art that could not be contained. Each was brilliant alone, but together they collided in ways that could not be disguised. A similar story unfolded with Robin Williams. When two comedic geniuses share a stage, audiences expect brilliance, and often, that's what they get. But sometimes sparks illuminate differences rather than harmony. Such was the case with Martin and Williams, two titans who admired each other deeply, but whose styles simply refused to align. Martin built his career on precision and wit. His humor, absurd yet disciplined, was finely crafted, every pause and punchline calculated to perfection. Watching him was like watching a master architect of comedy, weaving intellect into every movement. Williams was the opposite, a whirlwind of energy, chaos, and speed. His mind raced faster than most people could follow, spilling into improvisation, impersonations, and machine gun punchlines. He didn't perform comedy, he became it, unpredictable and explosive. Audiences adored the unpredictability, but, for Martin, who cherished control, it was like trying to tame a storm. The two were paired for a skit meant to showcase their differences. On paper, it was inspired. Martin's precision contrasted with Williams' anarchic spontaneity. In reality, it was combustible. At a pivotal moment, Williams veered wildly off script, unleashing an improvised bit that drew huge laughs but dismantled the rhythm Martin had meticulously built. For Williams, it was magic. For Martin, it was chaos. Martin later summed up the experience with one of his most memorable quips. Performing with Robin is like reading poetry on a roller coaster. It captured everything: his awe, admiration, and utter disorientation at trying to keep pace with a comic hurricane. To Williams, the roller coaster was freedom. To Martin, it was turbulence. Yet despite the clash, bitterness never entered the picture. Martin respected Williams' genius, recognizing him as a once-in-a-generation talent. He marveled at the way Robin could electrify a room, conjuring laughter out of thin air. Still, admiration didn't guarantee compatibility. After that skit, they quietly decided not to work together again. Respect remained, collaboration did. Not their divergence mirrored a deeper truth about comedy. Martin represented order, rehearsed, measured, deliberate. Williams embodied chaos, a flood of imagination, where mistakes became punchlines, and no script was sacred. Both dazzled audiences in their own ways, but together they overwhelmed one another. Martin never diminished Williams publicly. His roller coaster remark wasn't a barb, but a poetic acknowledgement of Williams' unique brilliance. Williams, for his part, never showed resentment. He understood his own style could overwhelm others, and from a distance, he respected Martin's mastery. With Goldie Hawn, the story was subtler. On screen, Martin and Hawn looked like a perfect comedic pairing. Their 1992 film House Sitter charmed audiences with farce, romance, and sparkling banter. To viewers, their chemistry seemed effortless to seasoned comedians perfectly in sync. But behind the scenes, it wasn't quite so seamless. There were no explosive fights, no tabloid feuds, but a series of quiet frustrations chipped away. Ed Martin's enthusiasm, discipline defined his approach. Years of stand-up had taught him respect for timing, rehearsal, and preparation. To him, a scene wasn't merely about lines. It was about rhythm, the invisible structure that made comedy land exactly when it should. Han thrived on spontaneity. Her bubbly charm and instinctive wit made her magnetic, but also unpredictable. On set, Martin would arrive early, script in hand, ready and rehearsed. Han, by contrast, often arrived late, breezing in with the confidence of a star who trusted. Her instincts, she improvised, adding lines or gestures not in the script. To her, it kept things fresh. To Martin, it risked disrupting the careful balance he relied on. He admired her talent, but the unpredictability grated off set. The tension deepened in quieter ways, eroding Martin's willingness to work with her again. At a party during the film's production, Martin brought out his banjo, an instrument he didn't just play, but revered. Music, particularly bluegrass, was one of his deepest passions, a craft he treated with as much seriousness as his comedy. As he played, Goldie, ever playful, made a lighthearted joke at his expense. For her, it was harmless teasing in a social setting. For Martin, it stung. He was known for his self-deprecating humor on stage, but in private, his music was sacred ground. That joke, small as it was, lingered with him. None of these moments turned into arguments. Martin remained polite and professional, and Han continued to sparkle both on and off screen, but small slights have a way of adding up. By the end of filming, Martin had come to a quiet conclusion. As much as audiences loved their pairing, he didn't want to repeat the experience. When offers surfaced later for the two to reunite on other projects, Martin declined. Two outsiders, it seemed puzzling. Why wouldn't he want to work again with a partner who had delivered box office charm? To those who knew him, the answer was simple. Martin valued harmony, and with Han, he hadn't found it. In interviews, Martin never spoke harshly about Han. He didn't air grievances publicly, nor did he diminish her talent. His criticisms, if voiced at all, were private and understated, but his actions spoke volumes. Hollywood thrives on proven pairings, and had Martin been willing, he and Han might have enjoyed multiple collaborations. Instead, House Sitter remained their one significant outing together. In the world of comedy, rivalries often simmer beneath the surface. What audiences see on stage or screen is laughter, camaraderie, and effortless timing. But behind the curtain, egos, tempers, and clashing personalities can shape careers and relationships. For Steve Martin, known for his meticulous approach to comedy and polished professionalism, one of his most bitter clashes came with none other than Bill Murray, a man whose unpredictable, rebellious spirit defined him just as much as his humor. The incident that sparked the rift took place during a live sketch performance in the late 1970s, when both men were at the height of their creative powers. Steve Martin, fresh off his wildly successful stand-up tours and Saturday Night Live appearances, had crafted a reputation for being not only hilariously original, but also impeccably disciplined. He believed in preparation, punctuality, and respect for the craft. Bill Murray, on the other hand, carried a reputation that was almost the complete opposite. Brilliant on stage, yes, but also notorious for his volatility, his lateness, and his tendency to test boundaries just for the sake of it. On that fateful night, Murray showed up nearly an hour late to a live sketch performance. To Martin, who had been rehearsing, timing the cues, and ensuring that everything would run smoothly, it was more than just unprofessional. It was an insult. And Murray didn't stop there. Once he finally arrived, he openly mocked Martin's famously clean-cut style, turning what should have been a shared comedic triumph into a battle of tones. The laughter from the audience only deepened the sting for Martin, who stood on stage, not as a partner, but as the butt of Murray's unscripted barbs. The tension was never openly explosive, but it cut deep. The audience may not have noticed the rift beneath the performance, but for Martin, trust had been broken. Comedy is built on rhythm, and rhythm is built on reliability. Without it, timing collapses, and in Martin's eyes, Murray had sabotaged both the moment and the bond. What followed was years of silence. After that night, the two comedians didn't speak for over a decade. The comedy world, surprisingly small at the top, kept placing them in the same orbit, but the two men treated each other like strangers. Even at major industry events, such as the Cannes Film Festival years later, where one might expect old colleagues to at least exchange polite words, they remained deliberately apart. No nods of acknowledgement, no backstage conversations, just a visible and intentional distance. Part of the rift stemmed from their completely different philosophies about work. Steve Martin valued professionalism above all else. For him, showing up on time, respecting rehearsal schedules, and treating every gig, whether a live sketch, a television taping, or a film set, as serious work, was non-negotiable. Bill Murray, on the other hand, embodied the chaos of improvisation. He thrived on spontaneity, sometimes at the expense of others. To his defenders, that chaos was part of his genius. To Martin, it was recklessness masquerading as charm. The irony of their falling out is that both men were giants of their generation, shaping comedy in ways that still resonate today. Steve Martin brought sophistication and a unique absurdist edge to American humor, while Murray infused it with an anarchic energy that broke rules and electrified audiences. Together, they might have created unforgettable work. Instead, the silent feud meant that what could have been a legendary pairing never fully materialized. The clash between Bill Murray and Steve Martin wasn't marked by shouting matches or public insults, but by the kind of quiet fracture that says more than words ever could. It was a professional relationship severed not by a single joke, but by a violation of trust, something Martin, a perfectionist to his core, could never overlook. For him, Murray's lateness and mockery weren't just bad behavior. They were signs of disrespect for the very craft that defined their lives. Years later, comedy historians and fans alike would look back on that rift with a sense of what might have been. While both men went on to extraordinary careers, their paths rarely crossed in any meaningful way again, and perhaps that was inevitable. Martin and Murray represented two poles of comedy: discipline versus chaos, structure versus spontaneity. When those poles collided on stage, the laughter was real, but so was the fallout. Award shows are meant to be nights of celebration, a chance for comedians to honor one another while giving audiences a taste of the humor that made them famous. But sometimes those stages reveal more than laughter. They expose rivalries, frustrations, and clashing philosophies of comedy. One of the most striking examples came at a comedy awards show in the 1990s when Jim Carrey and Steve Martin found themselves sharing a stage, and the result was anything but harmonious. Jim Carrey, fresh off the meteoric success of Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber, had become the living embodiment of manic energy. On stage, he was unstoppably rubber-faced, armed with an endless arsenal of wild voices and outrageous impressions. Audiences couldn't get enough of the chaos. But for Steve Martin, a veteran who built his craft on precision, discipline, and the elegance of timing, Carrey's brand of comedy felt less like performance and more like a storm blowing out of control. That contrast reached its breaking point during Carrey's awards acceptance speech. When he was handed the microphone, everyone expected a quick thank you. Instead, he turned the moment into a 14-minute free-for-all, sliding in and out of Clint Eastwood, Jimmy Stewart, Elvis Presley, and even impressions of fellow comedians sitting in the room. He shouted, mugged, and stretched the scene until laughter gave way to unease. What began as entertainment slowly tipped into indulgence, a performance so overwhelming it seemed to swallow the room whole. From his seat near the front, Steve Martin shifted uncomfortably. He knew awards shows lived and died by their timing, and that comedy above all else needed rhythm. Watching Carrey drag things out with unchecked improvisation grated on him. Finally Martin snapped. With a loud, exaggerated yawn, he strode up to the stage holding an oversized sign that read "Wrap it up." The audience erupted, believing it to be a clever gag, two icons playing along. But Martin wasn't joking. Behind the polite grin was genuine irritation. He had broken his own golden rule: never let the audience see frustration, because Carrey's disregard for structure had pushed him past the breaking point. Later, Martin admitted what the audience had only half suspected. He respected Carrey's raw brilliance, but found his style exhausting. For Martin, comedy lived in balance, knowing when to push forward and when to ease back. Carrey only ever pushed harder, louder, wilder, relentless. Their clash didn't end with that awkward night. Industry whispers later revealed that Martin had been offered a buddy comedy opposite Carrey, a pairing that on paper promised fireworks. But when Martin heard Carrey's name attached, he quietly stepped away. The memory of that awards show and the thought of months of similar chaos was enough. It wouldn't work, he confided to friends. We're oil and water. Looking back, it seems the conflict was unavoidable. Steve Martin embodied the polished side of comedy: clever wordplay, absurdist precision, carefully engineered routines. Carrey was its opposite: raw energy, unrestrained improvisation, spectacle over structure. Each approach shone brilliantly on its own, but together they clashed. To Carrey's fans, the awards speech was pure, Jim, fearless, unfiltered, larger than life. To Martin, it was a case study in why restraint mattered. Comedy, in his eyes, wasn't just about the laugh in the moment, but about leaving laughs that lingered without wearing out their welcome. Carrey's fire blazed hotter, but it also risked burning everything around it. The two men never grew close. They remained publicly respectful. Martin never disparaged Carrey, and Carrey never returned fire, but the distance between them was obvious. Hollywood tried again and again to pair them, yet Martin's reluctance never softened. That one awards night had left its mark too deeply, and perhaps that's the lesson tucked inside this story. Comedy isn't just about who can shout the loudest or stretch a joke the furthest. It's about rhythm, balance, and the delicate dance between indulgence and restraint. Martin knew it. Carey defied it. Together, they proved what happens when two visions of comedy collide and why some partnerships are destined never to be.